It was a cold autumn evening in Arizona when the last light of day stretched across the wide, empty plains, brushing gold against the dry grass and wooden fences of an old, forgotten ranch. Inside the small ranch house sat a man named Henry Dawson, a retired cowboy who had lived alone for nearly 20 years. His hands were rough as leather, his eyes gray like the desert sky, and his heart heavy with memories he no longer spoke of. He had no wife, no children, and no visitors. Only the wind and the cattle kept him company. But that night, as the wind howled through the canyon, something was about to change Henry's life forever. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to Moments of Love, and leave a like and comment if this story touches your heart. It started with a faint knocking on his door. At first, Henry thought it was the wind pushing against the wood. But then came another knock, firmer, desperate. He reached for his old shotgun, not out of anger, but habit. People didn't come out this far unless they were lost, or in trouble. When he opened the door, the last thing he expected to see was 5 women, wrapped in torn blankets, their faces marked with dust and fear. They were Apache widows. Henry could tell by their dress and the look in their eyes, strong, proud, and exhausted. One of them stepped forward, clutching a little child wrapped in a cloth. "Please," she whispered in broken English, "we need shelter, just for the night." Henry hesitated. Old habits ran deep. The history between white ranchers and Apache people had been soaked in pain and mistrust for generations. But something in their eyes, maybe that silent, wordless kind of sorrow, made him lower the gun. "You can stay," he said quietly. "Just for the night." He brought them inside, offered what little food he had, cornbread, beans, and water. The women ate slowly, silently, as if afraid to take too much. The child slept in one woman's lap, her hand gently stroking his hair. Henry sat across from them, the fire crackling between strangers who didn't know whether to fear or trust each other. When morning came, the women were still there, sitting by the fire, their faces pale with exhaustion. The oldest of them, her hair streaked with silver, explained what had happened. A smallpox outbreak had swept through their settlement, taking their husbands, their homes, everything. They had walked for days through the desert with barely any food or water. The nearest town had turned them away. "We will go," she said softly, "if you want us gone." Henry stared at her, his rough hand trembling slightly. He thought of the years he had spent alone, the empty table, the silent mornings. Something stirred inside him, not pity, but something deeper. "You don't have to go," he said after a long pause. "You can stay here. There's enough land for all of us." The women exchanged uncertain glances. But for the first time in days, hope flickered in their eyes. In the days that followed, the ranch began to feel alive again. The women cleaned the house, mended old blankets, and cooked meals that filled the air with warmth and spice. The child, a little boy named Kai, followed Henry everywhere, tugging at his coat, asking questions in broken English. Henry, who had forgotten what laughter sounded like, found himself smiling again. He taught Kai how to feed the horses, how to ride gentle ones, how to whistle to call the cattle. In return, the women taught Henry small things, how to cook beans with herbs he'd never tasted, how to weave grass mats, how to listen to silence without fear. There were still walls between them, invisible but fragile, like smoke that could vanish at the slightest wind. But slowly, kindness began to melt them away. Weeks turned into months. The ranch began to thrive. Henry had always believed his days of purpose were long gone, but now he found himself waking before dawn to work side by side with people who had once been strangers. They planted a small garden, shared meals under the stars, and even repaired the old barn together. But the real change came one winter morning. Kai had been sick for days, feverish, weak, his breathing shallow. The nearest doctor was 40 miles away, and the storm had made the roads impassable. Henry sat by the boy's side all night, holding his tiny hand in his calloused one. He whispered stories about cowboys and open skies, his rough voice trembling. "You're a strong one, kid," he murmured. "You'll make it through." When the fever finally broke at dawn, tears filled Henry's eyes. He hadn't cried since his wife died 30 years ago. One of the women, the boy's mother, placed a hand on Henry's shoulder and whispered, "You saved him. You saved my son." But Henry shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "He saved me." From that day on, something unspoken changed. The women no longer called him Mr. Dawson. They called him Henry. And little Kai called him grandfather. The seasons passed, and life found a rhythm. Word spread across nearby towns about the old cowboy who had taken in 5 Apache widows. Some folks laughed, others scorned him, saying he'd lost his mind. But Henry didn't care. He'd spent too many years being angry, too many years alone. Now, when he looked across his land and saw the women working, the boy laughing, and smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long, long time: home. One afternoon, a government agent rode up to the ranch. He said the women had no legal right to stay on the land. "They're not citizens," he said sharply. "You're breaking the law." Henry looked at the man, his weathered face calm but firm. "This is my land," he said, "and anyone under this roof is under my protection." The agent hesitated, then left, never to return. Henry's quiet courage spread through the nearby towns. Some folks who had turned their backs on the Apache began to soften their hearts, bringing food, blankets, and supplies. It was as if one man's kindness had broken through decades of silence and hate. Years later, when Henry grew old and his hands could no longer hold the reins, Kai took over the ranch. The women were still there, older, wiser, their hair gray but their spirits strong. Henry often sat on the porch, watching them with a peaceful smile. "Funny," he'd whisper, "I thought I was giving them shelter, but they gave me life." When Henry passed away quietly one spring morning, they buried him beneath the oak tree he'd planted years before. The entire Apache community came to pay their respects. The women sang ancient songs of farewell, their voices rising gently over the hills. And on his grave, Kai placed a small wooden carving, a cowboy and 5 women standing together beneath the sun. Years later, travelers passing through Arizona would sometimes hear the story of Henry Dawson, the lonely cowboy who opened his door to 5 widows and found a family he never knew he needed. They said the ranch still stood, green against the desert wind, filled with laughter, children, and kindness that refused to die. And maybe that's the lesson Henry left behind, that love doesn't always come the way we expect it. Sometimes it rides in on tired horses, knocks at your door in the middle of the night, and changes everything you thought you knew about the world. Because in the end, the greatest homes aren't built from wood or stone. They're built from kindness, from compassion, and from the courage to open your heart when it's easiest to keep it closed. And that's what keeps the world turning, even in the loneliest corners of it. Moments of love. Years passed like soft winds across the desert plains, carrying stories and whispers that time itself seemed to treasure. Kai had grown into a tall, kind man with the same quiet strength Henry once carried. The ranch had changed, fences rebuilt, fields greener than ever, and the laughter of children echoing through the valley. Henry's spirit still lingered there, in the creak of the porch steps, in the warmth of the morning light, in every lesson that had shaped their hearts. Kai never forgot the old man who had once opened his door to strangers. Every dawn, he rode out to the same ridge Henry used to visit, where the land stretched out endlessly and the sky met the earth in a perfect line. He'd close his eyes and hear Henry's voice again, calm, gravelly, and full of truth. It don't matter how much land a man owns if his heart stays empty. The Apache widows, now grandmothers, sat by the fire every evening, their hands busy weaving baskets or telling stories to the children. They spoke of a time when kindness was rare, when fear built walls between people, and how one man's compassion had torn those walls down. They spoke of Henry not as an outsider, but as family, as the one who taught them that love can grow even in the hardest soil. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, Kai heard the sound of hooves approaching. He looked up to see a wagon carrying 3 travelers, a young couple and their little girl. Their clothes were dusty, their faces tired. Kai could see the same look in their eyes that Henry had once seen in his mother's, desperation mixed with fragile hope. "Can we rest here for a while?" the man asked, his voice uncertain. "We've been traveling for days." Kai didn't hesitate. He smiled gently, just as Henry had all those years ago. "You're welcome here," he said. "This place always has room for those who need it." The woman's eyes welled with tears. The little girl ran toward the garden, laughing, her voice filling the air like a song. The older women watched from the porch, their faces soft with knowing smiles. It was as if life had come full circle, kindness passed down from one generation to the next, like a flame that never faded. Later that night, as the stars appeared one by one, Kai sat by the fire, telling the travelers about the man who built this home with his heart instead of his hands. He spoke of Henry Dawson, the cowboy who had once believed he was destined to live and die alone, until 5 widows knocked on his door and showed him what family truly meant. The couple listened in silence, their faces glowing in the firelight. When Kai finished, the woman whispered, "He sounds like the kind of man the world needs more of." Kai nodded. He said softly. But maybe what the world really needs is more people willing to follow his example. As the night deepened, the wind rustled through the cottonwood trees, carrying the scent of earth and memory. Somewhere out there, beyond the hills, it almost felt like Henry's spirit was smiling, proud, peaceful, and at home. The next morning, the travelers helped with chores before they left. They insisted on giving Kai a silver locket as thanks. Inside was a tiny picture of their daughter, and on the back were engraved 3 simple words: "Kindness never dies." Kai held the locket in his palm for a long moment. He thought of Henry, of the 5 women who had once arrived with nothing but courage and faith, of the countless lives touched by one simple act of compassion. He hung the locket by the front door, a symbol, a promise, and a reminder. As the years rolled on, the ranch became more than just a home. It became a refuge for anyone lost, hungry, or forgotten. Some came for food, others for shelter, but all left with something deeper, the warmth of belonging. Kai grew older, but his spirit stayed young, fueled by purpose. And when his hair turned gray and his hands trembled like Henry's once had, he often sat beneath that same oak tree where Henry was buried. He would talk to him, quietly, as though the old cowboy could still hear every word. "I kept your promise, grandfather," he'd whisper. "No one gets turned away." And sometimes, when the wind blew softly through the branches, it almost sounded like an answer, gentle, proud, and full of love. When Kai passed away, the people of the valley gathered once more beneath the oak. The descendants of the Apache widows, ranchers, travelers, and children stood side by side, their differences forgotten. They buried Kai beside Henry, under the same wide sky, and carved one simple line on the stone between their graves: "Kindness built this home." Years later, the ranch still stood, weathered, timeless, alive with the same spirit. Travelers still came, and the story of the retired cowboy and the 5 Apache widows continued to be told, not as a legend, but as a truth the world should never forget. And somewhere in the whisper of the desert wind, their story lives on, a reminder that one act of compassion can ripple through generations, mending hearts, changing lives, and lighting the path for those who come after. Because in the end, love doesn't die, it just keeps finding new homes to live in. That's the power of kindness, and the reason we still believe in moments of love.